You are all very, very welcome indeed. My name's Alvin Jackson. I'm the Richard Lodge Professor of History here at the University. And I also serve as a member of the Gifford Lecture Committee. Our Gifford Lectures, established under the will of Adam Lord Gifford, have been delivered annually since the late 1880s. By a succession of some of the most influential international scholars. They were intended to promote and diffuse the study of natural theology in the widest sense of the term. I'm delighted to welcome back our distinguished Gifford Lecturer for 2021, Professor David Hempton. This is a particular pleasure for me, both on intellectual and on more personal grounds, since I had the privilege of working alongside David when we each taught at Queen's University Belfast a painful number of years ago. But very many of you here in the audience will also know David through his work as one of the most internationally respected social historians of religion. Many of you were here also for David's wonderful two opening lectures at the beginning of the week. David is now a senior professor of divinity at Harvard, as well as being dean of the Harvard Divinity School. And today he's continuing his Gifford series on the theme Networks, Nodes and Nuclei in the History of Christianity, 1500 to 2020. And we'll be hearing shortly the third of his 6 lectures entitled Religious Networks in the Age of Empire in New Spain and West Africa. Now, please note, just as a quick business point, that the lecture and questions this evening are being recorded, and that the video will be shortly available online on the university's Gifford Lectures web pages and blog. And I now have the very greatest pleasure in handing over to David. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvin, very much. Neither of us has aged a bit since the 25 years ago that we were colleagues in QUB. So, well, look, thanks for coming out again. And this is our third lecture in the series. And you can see a little bit where we're coming from and where we're going to. We focused on the Reformation era in the second lecture. The third one's tonight. Then we're going looking at what I've called the Protestant International, Pietism, Premillennialism, and Pentecostalism. And then women's networks, opportunities, limitations, and then Christianity in the digital age. So let's get going with this one. Two of the most striking developments in the modern history of global Christianity have been the respective strengths of Catholic Christianity in Central and Latin America and the Protestant and Pentecostal Christianity in mostly sub-Saharan Africa. The aim of this lecture is to shed some light on these important stories by focusing on 2 early imperial case studies, one from the Iberian imperial conquest of New Spain and the other from the British imperial project in West Africa, specifically Sierra Leone. Second then, to what extent does the theoretical model of nuclei, nodes, and networks, which I'm working with in this series, to what extent does that help us understand better the various processes that produce such significant consequences for the global transmission of Christianity in the early modern and modern world? First then, I want to look at Catholicism and the Iberian Empire in New Spain and focus attention on different kinds of networks, specifically around shrines and images, the pious devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and diasporic Latin networks from Mexico back to the United States in the 20th century. Alas, I have to begin this third lecture with a historian's confession. Based on superficial reading and the ignorance that often besets we English-speaking scholars, I'd hoped to present you with a persuasive interpretation of how my focus on networks, nodes, and nuclei would fit very neatly into the encounters between Iberian empire builders and their accompanying friars and priests and native peoples in New Spain. Already mapped out in my mind was a narrative that went something like this. Territorial conquest and demographic subjugation in New Spain would be quickly followed by a Catholicization that featured an interconnected network of shrines and sacred places, within which there was a clearly delineated hierarchy of places, images, and cults, all served by the circulation of ubiquitous devotional materials in both visual and print forms. Crucial to my imagined explanation was the existence of well-traveled pilgrimage and processional routes, the blood arteries of religious penetration. Of central importance to my narrative was the existence of clearly identifiable centers and peripheries, both in terms of geographical space and in terms of shrines and objects of devotion. In this dendritic networked system, I expected to show that the nuclei would be specific geographic locations, such as Mexico City and Tepeyac, and singularly specific devotions, such as to Our Lady of Guadalupe. Vital to my project was the ability to show that long-distance pilgrimages from peripheries to centers, similar to those as in European Catholicism, were what sustained the networks. Alas, so much of what I assumed to be the case turns out not to be the case. My first instinct was to squeeze the evidence for the last piece of juice to support my theory, and my second was to give up and pick another topic. But I think there may be a third and more creative way. And here I'm indebted to the work of William Taylor, a great expert on the Iberian imperial project in New Spain, and luckily for me, a good tutor. In his important study of the 500 or so colonial shrines and miraculous images of New Spain, this wonderful book, Theatre of a Thousand Wonders, William Taylor concludes that, quote, shrines by definition reach beyond the local, but the history of image shrines in New Spain is less about a few central places interlocking with secondary shrines than it is about hundreds of clusters of communities with more parochial loyalties and sacred landscapes, where one devotion seldom eclipsed all the others. Where the webs of communication and circulation for regional shrine images can be traced, they show more movement of things and information about celebrated images and shrines than of people traveling to and from them. In other words, this is not primarily a network of pilgrimage routes or of well-orchestrated colonial or ecclesiastical propaganda, but rather a loose federation of sensuous devotional sites dedicated to images and apparitions of the Virgin Mary, Christ and the cross, and the saints of the Church. Their integrative power lay not in their proven connectivity of people, things, and places, but in their ubiquitous appeal to the most visually compelling, devotion-inspiring, and emotionally enchanting images and sacred personnel of the Catholic Church. Some of these regional shrines had pre-colonial associations, but most did not. Some were located in important colonial cities and centers of population, but many were not. Some were established within the first half century of the conquest, but most were founded in the long 17th century. Some connected with themes and motifs from Iberian Catholicism, but there were also very substantial differences, including the number of dark Christs and green crosses. Above all, shrines were sacred places where divine presence, power, and miraculous intervention met human desires for aesthetic beauty, transcendence, and healing. Taylor states that the shrines were regarded as little heavens on earth, ports in a storm, storehouses of wonder, genealogical deposits of forebears' devotion, sites for sensory exuberance and ritualistic expressions of dance, poetry, and music. They were affectionately cared for and sanctified by age and the loving marks of decades of touch and wear. Of all the images and shrines located in New Spain, but capable of transnational extension to other parts of the world, the emergence and growth of devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe stands out as the most significant. In an important essay on places of Our Lady of Guadalupe in 18th century Mexico, Taylor concludes that as the fame of Our Lady of Guadalupe reached into remote corners of the future Mexico, the image was on its way to becoming a dominant symbol. But it was a peculiar kind of dominant symbol, one that tended to reinforce the importance of many localities and images, more than ordering a vast spiritual geography. Territories of recognition and devotion were much larger than territories of sacred travel. As important as alms collectors, missionaries, pastoral visitors, and other official carriers may have been to the territorial reach of images and shrines, much of the dissemination occurred in secondary ways from provincial places and unofficial sources rather than from the main shrine. The point is that the widespread distribution of paintings and cheap reproductions of Our Lady of Guadalupe within Mexico and among peoples of Latin American descent everywhere were likely to take on lives of their own rather than propel the viewer to Tepeyac, which is where it started. That is largely the case even now when mass transit has opened up the possibility and reality of long-distance pilgrimage, and was even more true of the colonial period when pious wayfarers sought less for individual salvation in faraway places than for divine presence and favor in the landscape of home. So in terms of the overarching themes of our lectures, what is being described here is a different kind of network from, say, the printing presses of Luther's Germany, or the dependent schools and colleges of Ignatius of Loyola's Rome, though neither print nor the Jesuits are absent from this story either. To understand the evolution of this different kind of network, it is advantageous to know something about the origins and growth of the devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, from its supposed beginnings at Tepeyac in the early 16th century to its hagiographical promotion by the four Gospels of the mid-17th century, and from the establishment of its annual feast day celebrations in the 1690s to its vigorous efflorescence after Pope Benedict XIV's papal bull of 1754. Over time, the Virgin of Guadalupe became the most popular and geographically expansive of the many Marian shrines and images in colonial and post-colonial Mexico. But the point is that the devotional power of the image transcended its geographical and temporal specificities and did not depend on establishing Tepeyac as the center of a dominant tradition of pilgrimage. In this way, the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe was able to both to transcend the various political and dynastic shifts of power in Mexico's struggles for independence and serve a nationalizing purpose without becoming the temple of the national religion. Guadalupean devotion in the colonial period was centered more on provincial shrines and pilgrimages than on a national pilgrimage network focused on the origin site of Tepeyac. And in the post-colonial period, Guadalupean devotion was carried by Mexican migrants to other parts of North America and far beyond. Primacy among the sites of this devotional diaspora is the second Tepeyac, a sanctioned replica of the Mexican site, which is now located in Des Plaines, Illinois. This is a photograph I took of the Tepeyac site with the Virgin, welcoming the devotion of native peoples. This is a slide of really responding to a question in an earlier lecture of how both Mary and Jesus and other representations of Christianity were given, in this case, it's a black Jesus. In the Virgin of Guadalupe, it's a woman with obviously darker skin. So here are the two shrines, Tepeyac Hill in Mexico and Our Lady of Guadalupe Shrine in Des Plaines, Illinois. So replete with a digital copy of the original image from Tepeyac and imposing sculptures of the Virgin and Juan Diego, the person who allegedly started this devotion. So this Chicago site is now the world's second most visited Guadalupean shrine and maintains close contact with the primary site in Tepeyac, which has now got, I think, over 6 million visitors during the very short space of time of the celebration of this in December. In a powerful study of the devotional capital that sustains these shrines and others, Elaine Pena has shown how Guadalupean shrines in central Mexico and the Chicago area are transnationally linked by doctrine, tradition, aesthetic physical replication, and early 20th century labor circuits. The shrines are at the center of festivals, pilgrimages, daily rituals of cleaning and maintenance, and devotional piety, which participant observation can identify but never fully absorb. Pena's account of being on pilgrimage with a group of other women to Tepeyac evokes the earthy complexity of motivations and the rich variety of holy pieties. She writes, love and respect for the Virgin outweigh all other motives, but pride, money, family ties, the quest for freedom, curiosity, devotional capital, and the need for guidance, protection, and forgiveness mold the experience. Each peregrina's motivation for walking is distinct to themselves. So what kind of a network then is the devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and what are its nodes and nuclei? In part, it can be explained in the conventional terms of flows of personnel, images, and information, first in colonial Mexico and then to other parts of the world. It has as its center, its nucleus, a powerful image, a compelling foundational myth about the Spanish takeover of New Spain, Mexico, and an inspiring narrative. It reflects and negotiates colonial conquest, religious authority, and indigenous and ethnic solidarity. It both reinforces local loyalties and transcends national boundaries. It has a unified core of doctrines, aesthetics, and devotions, but it attracts devotional capital from many different experiences and motivations. It's not repudiated by religious authorities most of the time, but sometimes creates a problem of control for ecclesiastical institutions. Above all, it powerfully unites Latin American Catholics in a loose but sensuously evocative federation of faith and culture. Beginning in the early 20th century, the Virgin of Guadalupe and other Mexican-inspired devotions to the Blessed Virgin, the Infant Jesus, and the saints traveled along the migrant labor networks of Latino Catholics, up from Mexico City through El Paso to Chicago. Once the parish citadels of 19th century European Catholic migrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe, more than a third of the parishes in the Archdiocese of Chicago now have Spanish language masses, serving a remarkably diverse mix of national groups and generations of migrants. Mexicans began arriving in Chicago in large numbers in the 1920s, often as a result of incremental migration networks, chasing the changes in productivity and labor supply. In an evocative study of Chicago Catholica, Deborah Cantor shows how Chicago's traditional Catholic parishes became Mexican through the work of religious orders, such as the male Claretians and the female Cordimarians, the cultivation of distinctive forms of Mexican piety, and the virtual takeover of strategic parishes, such as Our Lady of Guadalupe in South Chicago and St. Francis of Assisi in the near West Side. These parishes became important centers of immigrant assimilation, sacramental devotion, ubiquitous votive candles, ethnic youth organization, beloved images of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, the Virgin of San Juan de los Lagos, Our Lady of Guadalupe, and a host of other saints connecting Mexican provinces and Chicago's Catholic parishes. Up and down the generational and spatial networks of migration, Mexican Americans constructed a popular and lively Catholic culture that fused their Mexican and Catholic identities. Crucial to that formation was the various ways in which the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe was at the center of parish churches, often after colorful processions from Mexican sites, feast days, and other popular devotions. For example, in St. Pius V Church, the painter Edward O'Brien painted the Mother of the Americas, depicting Our Lady of Guadalupe, entering a tableau of Mexican history from the conquest to the expressways of Chicago. Juan Diego gazes at the Virgin on one side, while the members of a Mexican-American family, rosaries in their hand, likewise contemplate her image from the other side. This is one of many instances of Guadalupean images in Pilsen parishes, processed from Mexico or created in situ. While predominantly Mexican parishes have come and gone with the labor and immigration cycles, the images are durable connections between devotional landscapes in Mexico and Chicago. In this way, real presence is able to move with migrants and pilgrims, and the material objects not only travel along networks, but are the constitutive components of networks themselves. How then can one explain the durability and transnational transmission of Guadalupean piety over almost half a millennium? And what is at stake for its devotees, past and present? Bob Orsi has proposed that in our study of religion, quote, we let the gods out of their assigned places, and we approach history and religion through a matrix of presence. He states that a dominant characteristic of modern historiography is to treat Marian devotion of all kinds as, quote, representations of social or psychological facts, symbols of something else, but nothing in themselves. He calls this modernity's ontological singular, a kind of reductionist way of looking at them. And he states that the interpretations share the assumption that what is happening when the transcendent breaks into time is not what appears to be happening to the men and women to whom it is happening, nor is it what they say has happened to them. A different approach to their reality and breaking into our reality is what my colleague Michael Jackson has called the inequalities of presence. To frame our understanding of Guadalupean piety this way is not to deny the realities of structures of power or cultural embeddedness, or to be forced into a post-Enlightenment discourse on miracles or divine intervention. Rather, it is to treat presence seriously, both for the images and artifacts of devotion, and seriously also for those expressing the devotion in something like their own terms. As with presence, so with place. In a fine parallel study of Our Lady of the Exile, diasporic religion at a Cuban Catholic shrine in Miami, Thomas Tweed works his way to a theory of diasporic religion privileging place, mapping, meeting, and migration, because all three are involved as groups draw on religion to make their own space and find their own place. As the pious make their own spaces, the spaces also make them. He sees the diasporic religion of Cuban Catholics in Miami as neither primarily locative nor supralocative, but translocative, moving symbolically between the homeland and the new land, and transtemporal, moving practitioners between a constructed past, their present, and an imagined future. It's a mistake to think that all diasporic religions, even those with a shared devotion to the Virgin, share exactly the same functions in exile. But those who retain a close attachment to a homeland shrine and an ancient Marian devotion carry with them the exilic themes of presence, place, and performance. Bringing this story up to the present, each year over 20 million pilgrims travel to the Virgin of Guadalupe's shrine at Tepeyac. We were two such pilgrims a while ago, and this is a photograph I took of pilgrims who had marched tens of miles. And you can see this kind of fusion of Aztec representations in the clothing with the banner to St. John the Divine. This is posing in front of the old cathedral in Tepeyac. One distinctive devotional practice captured in photographs and analysed by Jennifer Shipper Hughes is the carrying of replicas, images and portable shrines on the back of the pilgrims. You can see them here with any number of representations of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which are carried from distant parts all over the world back to this shrine in Mexico City. In this devotional labour, pilgrims turn their bodies into mobile altars, and they carry replicas to the shrine so that they can visit and draw power from the original site. When the pilgrim arrives at the devotional matrix, in this case at the basilica, the power of the replica is reactivated and renewed so that, returning to its place of origin, it preserves and maintains its potency in local and domestic devotion. While this is the case for pilgrims within Mexico itself, it also holds for distant pilgrimages from Chicago and elsewhere, which value not just the image of the Virgin, but its actual physical empowerment derived from a journey to the foundational shrine in Tepeyac. Intriguingly, the practice of carrying replicas on the backs of the pilgrims is not only a fusion of European Christian iconography with indigenous Mexican conceptions of religious materiality, but also reflects a pre-conquest practice of God-bearing in Mesoamerican religious practices. So this is digging into something even deeper in Mesoamerican religious practice. As material constructions of the Virgin Mary traveled along the networks of ethnic and national diasporas, whether Polish, Czech, Italian, Cuban, or Mexican, they assist in the formation, reformation, and reinforcement of the networks they travel by, and they help establish new nodes of exilic Catholicism, closely adapted to the particular cultural traditions they represent. What then is the balance sheet of treating the shrines and images of New Spain and Cuba and their subsequent transnational exports as part of our story of networks, nodes, and nuclei? Clearly, these 500 or so shrines in New Spain, with an additional cast of millions of mass-produced or homemade likenesses of their matrix images, moving along migration trails and into the homes, villages, and neighborhoods of the devoted. These do not constitute a formal and carefully designed network with a clearly demonstrated purpose. This is more a network of devotion based on shared images and symbols, located in specific places, but capable of translocal expansion all over the world. They were sometimes promoted by ecclesiastical elites and sometimes repressed when they teetered over the edge into the realm of unacceptable populist expressions. But mostly they were regulated, tolerated, and eventually celebrated. They were often sponsored and supported by other networks, such as those operated by the Franciscans and the Jesuits in print and pastoralia, and they had to be developed and maintained. This not only gave new opportunities for popular devotion, but they also served as recipients of fundraising networks around almsgiving, print selling, and image production. Above all, they were places where the immaterial divine could be encountered through material representation of the Virgin, the crucified Christ, and the historic saints, offering hope and protection against the dangers and vicissitudes of daily life. These were places where the divine could be embraced and evil resisted. Just say in conclusion to this section on the devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe is that it relates to a question that Jay, you asked a couple of nights ago. What is striking about this devotion is the way it intersected with all kinds of political movements in Mexico, from independence movements, first president of Mexico after the independence struggle, renamed himself Guadalupe. Populist movements in the 19th and 20th century around Hidalgo and Zapata, peasant movements, marched under the banner of Our Lady of Guadalupe. So this symbol, this important devotional construction, had the capacity to nation build. It had the capacity to overthrow established authorities, but always making an appeal to the deep popular devotion of the people supporting the movements. So it became a symbol of very considerable power. So I want to move from this story to another part of the world. And you see what I'm you see what I'm trying to do here through this. I'm trying to look at how these mobile movements that I'm calling, that have different forms of network constituents, have the capacity to move way beyond their origin sites. And they move with migrating peoples, they move with migrating cultures, and eventually they take on a life of their own and have very important consequences in different parts of the world where they become significant. My second story of networks within the context of empire relates to the British Empire, to evangelical Protestantism, slavery abolition, and the Christianization of Africa. In this case, the nucleus is the 3 C's of Christianity, commerce, and civilization, as predominantly evangelical Protestants across the Atlantic world envisaged a world in which slavery could be eradicated and the African continent could be transformed by the civilizational values of colonial elites. In this story, the most important nodes are London, Nova Scotia, and Sierra Leone, and the networks are vigorously transatlantic. In an important recent book on evangelicals and British public life, Gareth Atkins employs the insights of actor network theory developed by Bruno Latour and others to trace evangelical networks that span the church, universities, armed forces, and imperial officialdom, and which connected London and the regions with Europe and the world. According to Atkins, this was a ramifying web of pious individuals, tied together by shared beliefs, to be sure, but cemented by social contact and intermarriage, and lubricated or perhaps driven by patronage and ambition. Interstitially located between the Hanoverian world of deference and patronage and the Victorian world of subscription-based voluntary philanthropic societies, the evangelical fathers of the Victorians carved out a remarkable power base that extended into the 2 ancient universities, the Church of England's parochial structure, and the boards of the Bank of England and the East India Company, and some of the most important government agencies tasked with supervising Britain's imperial expansion. So he sees this evangelical groupings in London as essentially a set of networks along all of the lines I've indicated, reaching into the universities, the Church of England, the boards of the Bank of England, the East India Company, the government agencies, and so on. These networks were more extensive and more influential than the well-known Clapham sect, and support the view that evangelicalism in the 18th century was inherently a connection-making creed. As their ubiquitous correspondence and diaries show, these fin de siècle evangelicals were aided in their religious civilizing mission by the well-established patronage and clientage networks of Hanoverian Britain, and by the national surge of popular evangelicalism sponsored by the Methodists and Dissenters, who were mostly excluded from the centres of power, but were willing allies in Britain's national and international godly mission. Central to that godly mission in the decades after the loss of the American colonies was a powerful combination of anti-slavery mobilization, missionary zeal, commercial ambition, and civilizational hubris. The first and most important node where these forces came to be operational, the blueprint for the global Christian empire envisaged by the evangelicals, was Sierra Leone in West Africa. This was the location of attempts by British evangelical anti-slavery activists to set up a model settlement for freed slaves in Africa, from whence they had been so violently captured. The first such planned settlement of freed slaves in Africa was carried out under evangelical auspices and ended in disaster. The so-called Province of Freedom, which was initiated by the formidable anti-slavery activist Granville Sharp in 1787 for freed British slaves, was a grim failure, racked by disease, desertion, and disillusionment. Within a year of arrival, more than half of the almost 400 settlers had died, run away, or been discharged. But the second attempt 5 years later was both more unusual and more promising, and depended for its success on another network created by the vicissitudes of empire, this time in the American colonies and in Canada. In 1792, Thomas Clarkson's brother John was dispatched to Nova Scotia to recruit Black Empire loyalists to make the journey across the Atlantic and settle in Sierra Leone. So these were freed slaves who had were freed as Empire loyalists during the American Revolution, made their way up the Atlantic coast and settled in Nova Scotia. In Clarkson's almost millennialist words, this was no less than an attempt to civilize and Christianize a great continent, to bring it out of darkness, and to abolish the trade in men. Most of the 1,100 men and women of African descent who migrated from Nova Scotia to Freetown in 1792 were once North American slaves. The Black Nova Scotian community from which this reverse transatlantic migration originated had its roots in the promises made to black slaves in the American colonies by the British in return for assistance in the American Revolutionary War. Some of these unlikely Empire loyalists brought with them a religious faith birthed in colonial revivals that was given a further evangelical twist by the red-hot evangelicalism preached by Baptists and Methodists in Nova Scotia. They were also imbued with some of the spirit of democratic republicanism that fueled the American Revolution, and which was to lead to uneasy relations with their colonial evangelical sponsors, who saw themselves in a life and death struggle against the radical ideas of the contemporary French Revolution. Here was a migrating network of one-time slaves, forged out of imperial failure and revived by the transatlantic spread of popular evangelicalism. Out of this unlikely community of migrants came David George, born a slave in Virginia in 1743, revived in South Carolina before the American Revolution, then became the first Black Baptist pastor in Canada and the first Baptist pastor in Africa. He has left a spiritual autobiography that was transcribed from oral delivery and published in the Baptist Annual Register. According to this narrative, George, while still a slave, picked up the various Christian influences that wafted around the southern colonies in the 1760s and 70s. White Anglican plantation religion, the influence of slave believers, and New Light Baptist preaching all played their part in bringing him eventually to a classic evangelical conversion experience of awareness of sin, self-loathing, and joyful release. This was not quite a classical conversion narrative, however, for George was illiterate at the time of his conversion. Only later did he extract from the biblical narrative as the formal template for his own experience. I can now read the Bible, he states later, so that what I have in my heart I can see again in the scriptures, indicating that the oral and the personal was anterior to the written and the discursive in his experience. Here then is an example of how a European tradition of penitential Christianity and release from sin could be stripped of its literary superstructure and act directly in the experience of a black slave who experienced both a real physical bondage and a perceived spiritual bondage. George's conversion was followed by his British-assisted migration north to Nova Scotia during the American Revolutionary War. The black inhabitants of Nova Scotia were already a people in motion before a surprisingly high percentage of them decided to make the voyage across the Atlantic in the opposite direction from their enslaved ancestors. Just as West African slaves were a captive people in motion along well-established slave trade networks long before they arrived at the slave ports of the Bight of Biafra, the Nova Scotians had a migration history before they departed from Halifax, Nova Scotia, for Sierra Leone. The dislocations of the American Revolution had resulted in the migration of substantial numbers of free blacks to the cities of Savannah, Charleston, and New York. Scholars have shown how religious practices that were diversely spread across the southern plantations coalesced in more significant ways in the eastern seaboard cities during the Revolution, partly benefiting from client-patron relationships with the British military, partly facilitated by the greater population density of the cities, and partly fueled by a new generation of black preachers. Small but fast-growing black churches emerged from the chaos of war and mobility. David George, George Leal, Andrew Bryan, Jesse Peter, Brother Amos, all helped preach and pastor new churches among black populations in Silver Bluff, Savannah, the Caribbean islands, and eventually Nova Scotia. One scholar concludes that religious transformation such as George's, planted among former slaves who just become nominally free British subjects, the means to engage and define their liberty across a wider terrain and expands once the exclusive spiritual and political domain of their masters. Just as a popular form of black Christianity emerged from the migration of free blacks to eastern seaboard cities during the war, their subsequent migration northwards to Nova Scotia aided the process of new religious formation. Populations forced together to experience new freedoms on the move found solace, opportunity, and community support networks within emerging black churches. Nova Scotia added yet another dimension because it was already being revived by transplanted revival preachers from the British Isles and North America. David George and growing numbers of black migrants from the southern colonies added to the mix. In a sense, Nova Scotia emerged as an ethnic and religious junction box, not unlike the Azusa Street community that played such a significant role in the launching of Pentecostalism in the early 20th century. George and other black preachers virtually had a captive audience of black refugees. George's particular antinomian blend of American Southern and Nova Scotian New Light popular evangelicalism was first preached to the Black Empire loyalists in Canada and was then carried to Sierra Leone, where it encountered an even more diverse cultural melting pot. The Sierra Leone Company that was launched in 1792 to fund and organize the model settlement was a genuinely commercial venture with shares and subscription, but it never delivered on its own high expectations. The act abolishing British participation in the slave trade was quickly followed by the Sierra Leone Transfer Bill, which brought the whole project more squarely under the control of the colonial government and led to American recaptives from all over the continent being settled there. British colonial administrators envisaged the colony being Christianized and civilized. The words were often interchangeable, through the creation of model villages supervised by ministers and school teachers and united by the universal application of rules and sacraments. This tidy reapplication of the European Christendom model of the ecclesiastical parish as the chief engine of Christianization lacked many of the elements that made it work after a fashion in Europe. In Sierra Leone, there were no resident squires supplying a measure of economic stability and social deference, no fully agreed Christian tradition and authority to impart. There were representatives from a proliferation of European missionary societies and religious traditions, and no resident bishops. And there was little homogeneity among the idealized settlements. These parish-style villages, quaintly named after British people, places, and battles, transformed Freetown into a black diaspora, a bustling entrepot of refugees at large, with Freetown becoming a creolized, Caribbean-style cultural experience on African soil, a teeming crossroad of African and Western ideas, stirred with a mixture of religious elements, Muslim, Christian, and indigenous. So extravagant was the diversity that the CMS German missionary linguist Sigismund Köhle, in his Polyglota Africana, was able to document some 120 different languages spoken in the colony. What is particularly significant is the way in which the Freetown Nova Scotian contingent operated simultaneously both as missionaries and as the objects of mission. At the same time as they were being disciplined in the model Christian settlements, they were also Christianizing, albeit African-American Christianizing, the African recaptives. Here are multiple levels of engagement that gave rise to some revealing encounters. The British organizers of the Sierra Leone colony reported in 1795 that the Nova Scotians in their religious observances were punctual, Sabbatarian, well-dressed and disciplined, but that some had imbibed, quote, very inadequate or enthusiastic notions of Christianity, a few perhaps who set up hypocritical pretensions. Part of what was happening in Freetown was a version of the contest between European establishmentarian Christianity and new forms of populist evangelicalism, primarily Methodist and Baptist, that was being played out in many different geographical locations in the British Isles and North America. But the demographic collisions and cultural resonances of Sierra Leone also produced distinctively African expressions. The historical trail of what was going on stemmed in one direction from the 18th century Great Awakening and in another from the African-American missionary impulse. But there are also strands of European pietism with its radical distrust of religious establishments, and slave religion with its heart-stirring aspiration for spiritual and physical liberty. What came out of these different strands were not only competing visions of how Christianity should function in new colonial spaces, but also different constructions of the kind of Christian selves that should be fashioned. Consider, for example, the following three encounters. The first is between the evangelical Anglican governor of Sierra Leone, Zachary Macaulay, and David George. Macaulay, the English gentleman, regarded George and the Nova Scotians he represented as antinomians, a most seductive creed in which there were no means to be used, no exertions to be made, no lusts to be crucified, no self-denial to be practiced. Instead, he thought, they constructed their faith around instantaneous conversions, inexplicable mental impressions and bodily feelings, and the delusive internal feelings of a corrupt imagination. After a 12-hour discussion and debate between the two men, Macaulay's observation was that if any Nova Scotian believers were asked how they knew themselves to be a child of God, they would answer not from proof drawn from the Bible, but, quote, because perhaps 20 years ago I saw a certain sight, or heard certain words, or passed through a certain train of impressions, varying from solicitude to deep concern and terror and despair, thence again through fluctuations of fear and hope to peace and joy and assured confidence. In other words, a set of emotional experiences. Macaulay believed that God's evangelical kingdom in Africa could never be built from such ephemeral and transient materials. A similar conclusion was reached by one of his successors as governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, an Anglican, nominal Anglican from a strongly Roman Catholic background, and an establishment man and a soldier with a very clear idea of where his duty lies and an acceptance of the alliance of religion and duty. McCarthy was certainly no evangelical, and his vision of Christianization and civilization in Africa was to divide the Sierra Leone colony and then the entire continent into ecclesiastical parishes within which universal baptism would make a uniform Christendom. Not even the European missionaries with their evangelical roots could buy into that vision, never mind the Nova Scotians, and never mind the even more eclectic recaptives. W.A.B. Johnson, a CMS missionary, told McCarthy that he would not baptize more Africans, quote, unless God first baptized their hearts. He, McCarthy, said that the reason why so many were baptized on the day of Pentecost was that the apostles despised none. I replied that they were pricked in the heart and that I was willing to baptize all that were thus pricked in the heart. He thought baptism an act of civilization and that it was our duty to make them all Christians. So here are two visions of how Africa should be Christianized. One is territorial, liturgical, and universal, a product of the Anglican civilization that constructed it. The other is providential, experiential, and emotional, a product of a very different set of experiences. Our third encounter is probably the most significant of all. Moses Wilkinson, a blind, lame slave from Virginia, escaped to Nova Scotia during the American Revolution and was one of those who sailed to Freetown in 1792. As someone who had suffered more than most from the perfidy and broken promises of white officials, and who practiced and preached a populist evangelical message, Wilkinson objected to the official Christianity of the Sierra Leone colony. One suspicious colonial official who showed up to mock his preaching came away impressed by his ability to affect his hearers. Quote, many of the wise and learned in this world, he wrote, if they were to see and hear such a man as our brother, professedly engaging and endeavouring to lead their fellow creatures from sin to holiness, would at once conclude it to be impossible for them to effect the object which they have in view. Experience, however, flatly contradicts such a conclusion, he said. Numbers have been led by their means to change their lives. Colonial officials were justifiably nervous about the enthusiasm, antinomianism, indiscipline, and potential political radicalism of black preachers like Wilkinson. But there was no denying the fact that their version of Christianity was the one most likely to succeed among the burgeoning communities of recaptives deposited by the British Navy in Freetown. A shared suffering of body and spirit, and a shared sense of being marginalised by the structures of economic and political power enabled preachers like Wilkinson to build a base of communal authority that could not be matched by colonial officials or even by white missionaries. To these very different visions of how freed Africans and transplanted African Americans should reconstruct their selves or communities in their continent can be added still more layers of interpretation carrying enormous consequences for the globalization and indigenization of Christianity. Working out of the Sierra Leone experience, the religious independency and charismatic authority exemplified by the Nova Scotians and recaptive converts have been described as threshold phenomena that can thrive at the boundary between establishment values and the ideals of a people in transition. In other words, Christianity does not have to be regarded as a mere extension of Western norms, but carries within it, quote, pre-thematic local resonance for those on the frontiers of disruption, dislocation, resettlement, and restoration. In short, Christianity does not have to come encased in centuries of European civilization. We should not underestimate the energy and achievements of both Wesleyan Methodist and Church Missionary Society missionaries and others in building schools, colleges, churches, and parochial discipline in Freetown and surrounding villages in Sierra Leone. But over the long run, the realities of colonialism set their own limits. For the kind of Christianity forged by ex-African slaves in South Carolina, Nova Scotia, and Sierra Leone to thrive beyond local boundaries, it required the practical defeat of the European Christendom model, a vernacular Bible, translation as empowerment, and the transmission of Christianity shorn of Western cultural specificities and receptive to indigenous religious sensibilities. In Sierra Leone, for example, receptive Yoruba diviners who were thoroughly at home in the world of divination, visions, and the crowded company of unseen spirits welcomed the challenge of missionaries, saying that they were happy to add the Christian divinity to the Yoruba pantheon because a place already existed for that. What Lamin Sani has called the local religious grammar of rites, customs, and language shaped the emergence of a distinctively African form of Christianity and laid the foundations for its mass transcontinental appeal in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's difficult to overestimate the importance of this process for the remarkable expansion of Christianity in Africa in the modern period. In the long run, however, there was to be no happy ending in Sierra Leone, for the Christianity that was minted by the combined and often contradictory efforts of missionaries, settlers, recaptives, and colonial officials was largely obliterated by the political anarchy and civil war of recent times. But something very significant had happened at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries in colonial West Africa. Apparently inconsequential cells, refashioned in and out of slavery by the unlikely resources of populist evangelical Christianity, had demonstrated a capacity for large-scale transformation, not just in North America, but also in the continent from which they had been so brutally seized and so serendipitously resettled. David George's unlikely narrative and faith journey needs to be located within the context of the networks built around the transatlantic slave trade, colonial warfare, population migrations, popular pietism and evangelicalism, the rise of empire, the colonization of Africa, the growth of the Protestant missionary societies, and the geography of the slave trade. Although his life is singular and unique, its trajectory resonates with some of the most powerful forces of his time. His is one of the more powerful examples of the Exodus stories, so beloved by black Christians, and of the rise of African Christianity in both North America and Africa, which has reshaped the trajectory of global Christianity from the 19th to the 21st centuries. Given the projections from the Pew Foundation surveys about the growth of sub-Saharan African Christianity up to 2050 and beyond, this story about the evangelical and later Pentecostal surge of black Christianity is one of the most significant in the entire history of Christian transmission over 2 millennia. It could not have happened without the transatlantic networks and junction boxes we have been discussing. But networks and nodes also have their limitations. Paralleling the Sierra Leone experiment was a distinctively American version of African colonization in the neighboring territory of Liberia. Fronted mostly by the American Colonization Society from 1822 to 1847, and united by little other than an attempt to settle free African Americans in West Africa, the Liberian colonial experiment could never transcend the growing sectional tensions in the United States over slavery, and could never quite decide whether it was a model agrarian prototype for Africa or a missionary republic entrusted with the conversion of Africa, or both. Unrealistic expectations, inadequate funding, divisions among the supporters, disturbing on-the-ground moral controversies, and uninspiring leadership all contributed to the clouding of the American millennial vision to convert Africa. This is a kind of interesting story because it shows how networks could be in conflict with one another. So, and in the American case, rival networks, some of whom wanted to free African Americans and send them to Liberia. Others in the South, fearful of what this might do to the existence of slavery, eventually came into conflict with one another. There were other conflicts as well between those who thought that freed blacks could contribute to the American body politic, and others who thought that it was better for them and for the infant republic that they be resettled somewhere else in Africa, where they could construct their own society. So the missionaries who began to flow in from various denominational societies in the 1830s found themselves struggling to make an impact in Liberia, even on the American settlers, never mind the recaptives or the indigenous peoples. Liberia, according to Tom Whitaker, was unique in being the colony of a voluntary society and was never an imperial project of the American government, as evidenced by the lack of naval support by comparison with Sierra Leone. It nevertheless became the focal point for very many voluntary networks comprising America's benevolent and missionary empires, but it also illustrated the strengths and weaknesses of those networks. The Colonial Republic of Liberia never became the node for the Christianization of Africa, or for that matter, for the resolution of America's trials and tribulations over slavery and race control. So in conclusion, as these forays into religion and empire in the Americas and Africa make clear, Christianity, through its collaborative and subversive alliances with imperial power, whether Catholic and Iberian or Protestant and Anglo-American, has the capacity to deliver popular cultures of devotion, of extraordinary power, durability, and transmissibility, and also perpetrate cultural rape and cruelty of unimaginable proportions. These two things can operate side by side. No evaluation of the balance sheet, however uneven it may be, can rest on the ideologies and actions of hierarchical elites alone, but has to take into account these networks and nodes, some of which are surprising, hidden from view, but deeply influential in the shaping of the cultures we've been dealing with. Thank you.
Maybe while others are thinking, can I pitch a question to David about just thinking back to your lecture on the Protestant and Catholic Reformations and the production of, for want of a better description, your kind of nuclear texts. And can I relate this to your lecture today and ask about the production of Marian imagery? It seems to me that there may not be, but there may be a story associated with the kind of the honing and construction and distribution of these images for the faithful.
Yeah, there definitely is a story in the same way. So these shrines, the Theatre of 1,000 Wonders that I've been talking about, eventually over time, set up quite a circulating medium of devotional literature, reproduction of images, as you rightly say. So it became quite almost a transatlantic as well. Some of these things are produced in Spain, others in New Spain. So there is an associated range of materials flowing up and down through these devotional networks. I think one of the difficulties with this, I think, is that these became economically important prizes, for sustaining the shrines themselves, for collecting money for alms and charity and so on. So they actually do become little commercial enterprises, and obviously now are huge. People have these images and in their homes and in churches, all around the world. Not just even, the migrations of Hispanic Catholics, but these, Our Lady of Guadalupe images are now appearing in Protestant churches all over the place, and so it's quite a. For me, it's a kind of a remarkable story of how this Guadalupean devotion, which originally began in Castile in Spain in the medieval period, gets transplanted pretty quickly. This early vision of Juan Diego in 1531, where he alleges that he has this, 5 encounters with Mary, which produced this remarkable image in his cloak, which is now, one of the photographs there was of me, was my photograph taking it along this moving pathway in this basilica in Mexico. You're glancing up at it, and there's this huge collection of people behind you. So this is a very powerful image, and for me, what's at stake here, and you asked this question the other night, to what extent is empire and the structures of power doing this? And on one level, this conquest of Mexico is extremely brutal. But yet on another level, these Christian symbols of Mary and the saints and of Jesus, over time, get appropriated and owned. And even when there is the opportunity to throw them off with independence revolutions or with popular uprisings from below, they actually march with these images, as signs of popular fidelity. So you can't say, on the one, this is just a naked exercise in imperial power. There's something else going on. So what intrigues me is just thinking about networks in ways that get you beneath the surface of naked imperial domination and get you into another kind of arena.
Thank you. Can I take Emma and then Owen, please?
Thank you very much. I just wondered about the contrasting examples you've given today. We had the rich materiality of Our Lady of Guadalupe and the shrines. And in the way that you told the transatlantic story, there was almost nothing of material, which may be a Protestant and Catholic divide,
Right.
that the materiality doesn't matter. But historians have often seen materiality in Protestant forms of devotion. They're just different. I just wondered if you could comment on that and how far these material forms influence networks and how far they don't.
Yeah, it's a great question and a tough one to answer in a way. I mean, you're absolutely right that there is a big contrast in these stories. And the first one, you know, I do struggle, interested in your views about whether you can think of this. I mean, what I struggled with, you could hear in the first 4 or 5 pages of that lecture, was the extent to which these shrines and images constitute a network at all. On one level, I'd kind of hoped for much more interconnected traveling around them and as pilgrimages virtually. But what I discovered in the research for it was that they are intensely local based and attract, you know, an enormous following from localities. I think of them as networks because they are all over New Spain. They are very powerful places where the divine presence is encountered by local populations, and which, you know, the point that Alvin was making, do eventually get serviced by these novenas and images and so on. But you're right, you know, moving across, you know, with, and there the story is very complicated because these empire loyalists brought nothing with them out of slavery. You know, they were essentially, you know, mobilized by the far more wealthy networks based around evangelicalism in London, and, you know, brought in that way. But I mean, I have not been to Sierra Leone, and I don't really know how much of a kind of Protestant iconography survives there in any way. But we're definitely talking about a different kind of, you know, set of networks, which are based more on connection with older African traditions of religion, are based much more on experiences, on the Bible as an idea more than a written text, because for many of these people, although some had, you know, remarkable oral knowledge of biblical verses and so on, this was not based on any reading. So I think you're right. It is a difference between, you know, Protestant and Catholic. So this is a, you know, coming out of what we were talking about yesterday, the differences of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations.
Owen, and then the person at the back.
First of all, a personal point, if I may make it. Thank you for teaching me so much about my own religion today that I did not know. It's a marvelous example of how what seems to be so finite in the hands of so many historians is shown by you to be so complex and at the same time so comprehensible in quite a different way. You are doing a tremendous work in bringing human beings back into the story. I have a small point to make about the other part, Sierra Leone, etc. That's complex too. I first of all should say that it's very wonderful to be hearing such remarkable discussion on Sierra Leone when I remember the tremendous work carried out here by my late colleague Christopher Fife, who certainly laid the foundations, I think you'd agree, of historiography over here on Sierra Leone with his marvelous and very large book and the other writings. He would be annoyed with me for the point I'm about to make. That is It's, again, your method of posing two different human beings confronting one another. The case of the several cases you looked at. In the case of Daniel George, there is a problem on the other side. Zachary Macaulay wasn't an Englishman. He was born Issachar Macaulay. His first language was almost certainly Scots Gaelic. He doesn't really become English until he has left Sierra Leone. Clapham had to come later. Right. So we're talking about somebody, therefore, who is, you're absolutely right, having a remarkable closed-mindedness, but partly closed because he himself has made a complex journey from a different culture, and one which, in a sense, would always be held against him, however English he tried to become. So, and you can see a certain amount of this in the difficulties that his son, Thomas Macaulay, had in being aware of his father's Gaelic and inheritance, and really almost being schizophrenic and partly wanting to celebrate it and partly wanting to anglicize it. So that I think your method here is absolutely splendid. It's just I think that you'll want to give Zach a little more time to be Issachar.
Thanks very much. I do stand corrected about Zach. Thank you so much. That's really interesting background on him. McCarthy also is a kind of interesting figure that, you know, there's a lot of dispute about whether he was in any sense an Anglican at all. He was obviously from a strong Roman Catholic background.
Would that have been Gaelic?
I don't know. Yeah. But in very different articles, some referred to him as Anglican, some as a crypto-Catholic, some as a real Catholic. When you look at his will, there are all kinds of Catholic, you know, phrases in it and so on, which seem to have been the dominant. In other words, I think he really was a Catholic, but with a kind of Anglican veneer, but never a formal recusant. Yeah. So these people who fetch up on the, you know, the imperial fringes themselves, as you rightly point out, have very complicated, you know, histories and trajectories which inform this kind of conversation that they have.
There's a question right at the back.
Put your hand up, please. Oh, sorry, thank you very much. Yeah, I've been really fascinated in the last few lectures by the themes of kind of place and confession. And I just ask about place now, because on the one hand, it seems like place would be a constraint on the networks, but as you were talking about today in South America, there's actually a kind of conscious attempt to replicate place on a large scale and on a small scale. And then also in the African example, the place of Freetown has a kind of a strong spiritual and symbolic resonance. So I was kind of interested in the ability of networks relating to place, but also transcending them. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I mean, in a way, I'm kind of trying to have my cake and eat it in these lectures, a little as you can see. I mean, in some ways, you know, trying to look at a nucleus of something that can get transmitted. In tonight's case, this very powerful foundation myth of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which has this extraordinary range. And what I'm really arguing for the African case is for a certain kind of Christianity that emerges not from European Christendom, but from the you know, the freed slaves on the move. So I have this nucleus, and then the nodes, you know, so this is the places, you know, Tepeyac, where this foundation myth happens. And then the various connective tissues around the shrines, and then the connective tissues in the 20th century back into North America and beyond, through the migration labor routes, you know, into El Paso and up the trail of new industries and so on, right into Chicago itself and wider afield. So the places become important in these stepping journeys. Sometimes, you know, these nodes, something new happens with them. Sometimes they're just staging posts along the way. They're literally, almost like, literally just staging posts on the way on their journeys. So in a way, the point you're really getting at, which is a really good one, is the extent to which place and specificity is changing what is happening, or whether, and here I am a little bit, relying on my kind of viral kind of, that there are these ideas which you might say is like is like the coronavirus or whatever, and as it moves and new variants do arise, still recognizable as the same degree cluster, but in different places have very different constituent elements. And I think that's what's happening here. I just think there are places where something very significant happens that I'm calling nodal places, where something vital and in the case that I was making around Sierra Leone, I do think there are two networks coming together, these very powerful set of Southern England-based networks around the evangelicals who are cementing themselves in London. Gareth Atkins does a great job with this. And then this other kind of network which they've serendipitously got very little connection with, the freed Empire Loyalists who fetch up in Nova Scotia, but then the two connect. And one network facilitates the other network, but then they fight, over what kind of virus this is going to be, if you like, in Nova Scotia. So, but yeah, so I think that your point is really well taken.
Yes.
Thank you. Just a comment on bodily experience as music and how it can be a unified experience on both, like on several of the networks, and how they can have a role also in the export of a message or a particular network. Yeah. Have you had any, have you encountered any such evidence in your research? You mentioned in Germany, in the beginning of the Protestantism, yeah. But in these other networks, do you have evidence of that as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I knew more about it. I'd say a couple of things. I do think that songs and hymns become extremely important in these networks of transmission. I wish I knew more about the songs and hymns that are exported through the Nova Scotians into Freetown. I just don't know enough. But music, I referenced this in the first lecture. I saw this program a few months ago on the rise of jazz, and the importance of these different musical traditions that come together in New Orleans in the early 20th century, and then some twists and turns, and you get the emergence of these very first jazz musicians, which coincides with a technological change. The first production of transmissible music through recordings, which then flow with these migrating black jazz musicians along the migration routes back up to Chicago, across to Los Angeles, and so on. So music, becomes a dynamic part of the black diaspora and gives it a great deal of its sustenance and power. I think the same kinds of things are happening, I say, in the Lutheran Reformation with these ubiquitous hymns and popular versions of them. Something very similar is happening now. I did some work for these lectures on this enormous production of praise music coming out of Hillsong Church in Australia, which has now, had a huge impact on on popular Protestant forms of worship right across the world and has made an impact on Catholic forms as well. So it's a real, huge enterprise that's coming out of this, with an enormous number of recordings and a big commercial side to it. So music is definitely part of the story, and I know I'm going to have to do more work on that. I'd love to hear the culture of sound of these, including the culture of sound of these gatherings at these, theatre of 1,000 wonder shrines in New Spain. What is the local culture of sound at those shrines? I'd love to know more about that. And there are people, I'm sure William Taylor knows the answer to this question. I just don't.
Is there a final question, Jay?
Thank you for another fine lecture. I was struck at the beginning when you were talking about the networks involving Our Lady of Guadalupe. You said that you found it a bit unstructured and messy, and it was difficult to bring it together. And yet this was the most successful and lasting of your stories.
Yeah.
It's very powerful because it seems to have been spontaneous, unstructured, unconscious, following the Diaspora movements. But the second set of networks were conscious, were planned, were structured from outside, and they were less successul.
Yes.
Was that part of the story that you were intending to tell us?
It is part of the story, but no, you're absolutely right. That bit of confession at the start, that when the confession is I knew almost nothing about. I think we English speakers often don't know very much about the Iberian empires and New Spain, and I got into this through both a friendship with William Taylor and reading his wonderful works. Actually, a very talented historian. And I'd hoped, when I sort of thought of because I read the book Theatre of 1,000 Wonders, and I had in mind that these shrines would have, you could just draw little lines, just connect the dots, and you'd have these very powerful networks. And to some extent that's true, but that's not really his argument. His argument is that these, as you've put it, that these were not structured networks, that they arose in almost in some kind of spontaneous generation in localities. Obviously they're being influenced one by another, there's no question about that. But the actual, the movement around them, in other words, they become almost sacred sites of a place rather than connective tissues. But what I do think gives, to push back a little bit on the question, I think if that's how it starts, I do think that the, Our Lady of Guadalupe, I think it's much easier to demonstrate the roots of transmission of that image and that devotional cult through, migrating pathways. From from the 17th century on. So that one I think you can demonstrate. I've followed these churches myself a little bit, through El Paso up into Chicago, and these images that are striking in all of these churches. I think that's a story of connective tissues. They're not appearing just ex nihilo. They're being carried by migrant people of Hispanic descent for whom this has become a vital part of their, and not just in America. These are these are going to the Philippines. They're going anywhere where Catholicism has a strong hold and following. But you're right that this has proved to be extremely powerful and durable. I sort of think, and here's a stretch argument, the kind of Christianity I'm appealing to through David George and Moses Wilkinson, I think that is the kind of Christianity that is sweeping Africa right now. It's a kind of, it's sometimes bracketed as Pentecostalism, but it actually has, it's a very But I do think that there's something going on here between the Christendom model of how Africa was to be Christianized versus this much more intuitive, experiential, less theologically organized, much more coming out of African traditions and slave experiences and so on and so on. And so I do think it was successful ultimately, even though it had hard beginnings in Sierra Leone and Liberia.